Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the latest European Parliamentary Research Service Policy Roundtable. I'm Anthony Teasdale from the EPRS, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this event today. And we are going to be discussing the question of fundamental rights in the European Union, and indeed potentially beyond, under the rubric A Union of Rights and Values. Where are we on fundamental rights in the European Union today? Whilst the community, of course, had its roots in the process of economic integration across the European continent, fundamental rights and values have increasingly become a key hallmark of the European Union and its projection in the outside world. And this process has occurred through legal text, through jurisprudence, and through active practice. And increasingly, citizens of the Union look to the EU itself to be a union of rights and values, and one that also protects them as such. But there's an external dimension to this, of course, as dramatically shown by recent events in Ukraine. The union of values is very strongly perceived in the way that the European Union is seen elsewhere in the European continent and indeed around the world. And it's become a central issue, inter alia, in the process of accession to the Union. So we're going to be talking about some of these issues today. The timing is apposite. It's almost 22 years since the signature of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, and it's 15 years since the creation of the EU Agency of Fundamental Rights based in Vienna in 2007. This EPRS roundtable has a distinguished panel which will attempt to take stock of where we are and where we're going in that respect. We're particularly privileged to have Otmar Karas, MEP, First Vice President of the European Parliament, and Michael O'Flaherty, who is the Director of the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights. But we also have a distinguished panel of practitioners and experts in the field. Professor Elise, Head of the Department for International European Law at KU Leuven and visiting professor at the College of Europe in Bruges. She's speaking to us from Leuven. Paul Nemitz, who is Principal Advisor in the Directorate General for Justice and Consumers, just at the European Commission. He's joining us from Brussels. Dr. Sarah Ganti, Postdoctoral Fellow in the Human Rights Centre at Ghent University and Co-President of Yale Law School's European Law Association. She's joining us from Budapest. And Dr. David de Groot, who's a policy analyst in the Citizens Policies Unit here in the EPRS, the European Parliamentary Research Service in Brussels, from where he also joins us. And that panel discussion will be moderated by Michela Del Monte, who is head of the Citizens Policy Unit in EPRS. So we have an excellent lineup and a really important topic. And I'm going to ask Otmar Karas if he would like to join us now to set the scene. Vice President Karas has been a member of the European Parliament from Austria since 1999. He is the first Vice President of the European Parliament and is responsible, inter alia, for information and communication policy, for the Members' Research Service and Library, both of which sit here in EPRS, and for relations with NATO, the OSCE, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. He's a member of the Parliament's Bureau, but also of the Parliament's Committee on Economic and Monetary Affairs and the Parliament's Delegation for Relations with the United States. And prior to his election to the European Parliament, he was a member of the Austrian Parliament and Secretary General of the Austrian People's Party. And after Otmar has spoken, Michael O'Flaherty, the Director of the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights, will also give an overview of where we are on fundamental rights in the European Union today. So first, Otmar, and thank you so much for sparing the time to join us.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Ladies and gentlemen, meine Damen und Herren, liebe Freundinnen und Freunde, dear Michael, cher Etienne, why are we dedicating our time today to discussing rights and values? Why? Because rights and values are one of the most precious assets of the European project. It has not always been so. Let me recall briefly where we come from before we move to the heart of our discussion. It all started with an economic project for Europe's prosperity, the European Community. The economic project, as you know, was meant to secure peace. Then gradually rights and values emerged and developed. In the treaties, in the case law, and even more in the aspiration of Europe's peoples. These rights and values were embodied in the European Union's Charter of Fundamental Rights. The Charter was incorporated in the treaties and became legally binding with the Lisbon Treaty. These are just a few lines from a story you know very well. Let me now say a few words on how I see these rights and values for the European Union. The European Union is based on democracy, freedom, fundamental rights, and the rule of law. These three, democracy, fundamental rights, and the rule of law, are interlinked. Together, they form the fabric that binds and strengthens the European Union. To have only one of these three is not enough. The fabric would tear apart. Take formally democracy, for example. On its own, it's not enough. It does not secure the rights and values we all want. It has to go hand in hand with independent courts, with a free press, with freedom of expression, so that we can have diversity of opinion in the public space. Our history has shown, and what happens in the other parts of the world has confirmed. It is the agreement, the commitment to these rights and values that unites our society and makes it stronger. This strong commitment to rights and values in our societies. Different political opinions are fine as long as we have this strong agreement. By contrast, tyrannical regimes hate freedom of expression. They hate checks and balances. They hate free courts and independent justice. They hate them because they see them as a threat to their power, as a threat to their authoritarian stance. This is what, ladies and gentlemen, this is what Vladimir Putin could not see at his doors. If our rights and values are unacceptable to tyrants, by contrast, they are a beacon of hope to millions around the world. Being a beacon of hope is instrumental. It can open a door. It can lead the way. And today reminds us of this. Today, the International Day against homophobia, biophobia, and transphobia. Why 17th of May? Because it was on the day in 1990 that the World Health Organization removed homosexuality from the international classification of diseases. This decision was a beacon of hope and opened the way to changes worldwide, as we will hear during the roundtable. The same way that our rights and values are a beacon of hope worldwide. Did you know that our Charter of Fundamental Rights is quoted as part of the International Corpus Juris by the Inter-American Court? Yes, our European Union, as a union of rights and values, has become a reference for beyond its borders, as far as Costa Rica, where this court is based. We were 6 when we started. Today we are 27. We inspire courts on other continents. What a successful model we are. This reminds me of a major speech delivered in my dear Vienna, the home city of the Fundamental Rights Agency. It was Timothy Snyder's speech to Europe telling us, I quote, "You have created a huge zone of exception in the positive sense." End of quote. Countries and peoples who dream of joining the European Union dream of peace, they dream of prosperity, but they also dream of our rights and values. We have seen this with the people and countries that have joined us over the years. We are seeing this today with Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. And this, ladies and gentlemen, this gives us a responsibility. This means very concretely that we have to stand for this union of rights and values. We have to defend it. We have to fight for it, internal and external. Why? Because history can turn. We knew it from history books and classes. We are seeing it before our eyes in the news. This is why, ladies and gentlemen, this is why I consider that the launching of the rule of law mechanism against Hungary sends a right and positive signal. The European Parliament has asked for it, and it continues its fight to defend EU values in Hungary, as it did just 2 weeks ago in plenary. I take hope and confidence in our citizens' interest in these rights and values. We have just seen this interest again in the Conference on the Future of Europe. The topic EU rights and values, including democracy and the rule of law, received thousands of contributions. And this is good news, because every day shows the relevance of our rights and values. Look at the news and what is happening in countries that don't benefit from them. Look at the ethical issues raised by social media, data collection, and artificial intelligence. And I am thinking of the European model of data protection here, looking at the long road to gender equality in action, hopefully some progress towards having more women on boards and combating violence against women. I would like here to pay tribute to the European Parliament's long and strong tradition of being in the vanguard when it comes to pushing for EU law and safeguarding rights. Ladies and gentlemen, I have briefly sketched our story, considering all we have done. It is a successful model. We inspire people and offer hope across the world. And this, too, is a success. But every day reminds us that risks, threats, and setbacks are everywhere. Every day, new challenges appear. To finish with our key question, where are we on fundamental rights in the European Union today? The very fact that we are meeting to discuss this question shows our shared commitment to defending and promoting this union of rights and values. With that in mind, I am very much looking forward to our roundtable discussion. Thank you. Vielen Dank. Merci.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Vice President Omar Karas, for setting the scene so effectively and by drawing attention to the absolute centrality and importance which the European Parliament as a political institution attaches to the question of fundamental rights in Europe and beyond. And what an effective quotation from Timothy Snyder. You have created a huge zone of exception in a very positive sense. And as we think about the war in Ukraine, we realize the power of those words. Now to give us an overview and take stock of where we are on fundamental rights in the European Union today, I would like to pass the microphone to Dr. Michael O'Flaherty, who is the director of the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights and has held that job since 2015. He's a former professor of human rights at the University of Nottingham in the UK and the National University of Ireland in Galway. He's been a member of the United Nations Human Rights Committee, including serving as its vice chair. And he's also held a variety of other UN positions, including in Bosnia-Herzegovina and in Sierra Leone. He's also served as Chief Commissioner of the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, as Chairperson of the Irish Penal Reform Trust, and as Vice Chair of the Universal Rights Group. A solicitor of the Irish courts, he received a doctorate in law at the National University of Ireland and holds degrees in international relations, philosophy, and theology. So, Michael, it's a great pleasure to have you with us. Over to you.
Anthony, thank you very much. It's my great pleasure. I appreciate very much the invitation and the event. And I greet you, I greet First Vice President Karas and all the colleagues this afternoon. I'd like my starting point to be one of us, and indeed it echoes what the First Vice President said, of being incredibly proud of what has been achieved on this continent. On the continent, bigger than the EU, but on the continent, we have put in place the most sophisticated system for the protection of human rights that has ever been seen on Earth. It began, of course, with the European Convention on Human Rights, the European Court of Human Rights, the very important work ongoing of the Council of Europe. But then you have the EU itself, which self-identifies as a champion of human and fundamental rights, underpinned by the Charter and defended by a court in Luxembourg that takes brave, principled human rights decisions repeatedly. So they're just elements of the framework, but we should have a framing starting point of a remarkable achievement of global significance. But of course, I have to very quickly then move to the concerns. There is no room whatsoever for complacency. And as you look at the array of human rights challenges across the EU, I would identify 6 that are predominantly catching my attention. The first is the persistent exclusion of some groups from our societies. I'm thinking in particular here of the Roma, the 6 million Roma men, women and children who are persistently across generations shoved to the edges of our societies with remarkably little progress to show over the years, despite many heroic efforts. I think of Jews. I think of the fact that we have not yet eradicated the curse of anti-Semitism. And when times get tough, such as during COVID, we see a resurgence of anti-Semitic activity. And so persistent exclusion of some groups. Second, and closely related, the persistence of hate crime and hate speech to very, very serious levels, hugely magnified, of course, by social media and the role in which social media plays in facilitating such hate speech and crime. Which has reached proportions that are deeply worrying. And I should say, by the way, that we see that this hate is largely gendered. It hits women far more notably than it does men. The third of my 6 concerns is a difficult one to convey, but let me try and articulate it in terms of a disjunction between our law and policy on the one hand and societal attitudes on the other. We see far too often that societal attitudes are not keeping up with the adjustments to law and policy. I take, for example, here the situation of members of the LGBTI communities. In many places, not all, but in many places in the EU, we've made dramatic advances in terms of law and policy, and the EU strategies themselves are very clear and very good. But it's still the case that people are afraid to express their LGBTI identity in too many places. We know in the agency from our surveys, for instance, that there is not a single place in Europe where more than 50% of LGBTI people would walk down the street holding hands. That's an example of a disjunction that is my third concern. The fourth concern has to do with socioeconomic inequalities. We are willing, it appears, in our European society to tolerate an extraordinary disparity in our societies between the experience of the poorest and the experience of those with the most. It's extremely worrying. If you're a Roma, you are 8 times more likely to experience poverty than a member of the settled population. That's just one example of a deep worry, which, by the way, becomes ever the more visible and ever the more problematic in a moment such as now, where we're facing into one of the worst phenomena of inflation that we've seen literally for a generation, because in a context of inflation, you get an exacerbation of inequality, a deepening of the experience of poverty where we find it in our societies. The fifth of the six concerns I would flag to you today is the attempts to erode the human rights infrastructure at national levels. The first Vice President spoke to us, and it's so important. We have to acknowledge the extent to which efforts are underway in too many places to undermine such elements of the infrastructure for rights as independent courts, thriving free media, a civil society which is cherished in our society, and even to some extent, societies where our national human rights bodies, such as human rights commissions, are valued and given what they need to do their job. And the sixth and the final of the categories of concern that's on my mind right now is a single cataclysmic event, the war in Ukraine. It's been mentioned already, but you cannot speak about human rights without speaking about it. In the first place, it's about the most devastating blow to the human rights of Ukrainians living in their own country. Every death is a complete stealing of human rights. Everything about war undermines human rights. I lived in Sarajevo for periods during the siege. I was privileged. I worked for the UN. I was relatively safe, but I could see what was happening around me. I could see the extraordinary pain, the acute trauma that's done to every man, woman, and child suffering from under a military assault. And it pains me greatly that it's happening again just a few hours' drive from where I am here in Vienna. And then, of course, we have the impact of the Ukrainian conflict for the respect for human and fundamental rights inside the EU. I have in mind here, in the first place, the reception of the almost 5 million people who have come, mostly women and children. I'm deeply impressed by the levels of generosity and opening of doors, but I'm also concerned that we maintain the generosity and we take care of vulnerabilities and we avoid such criminal acts such as trafficking, abduction of children, other compromises of protection. And so we have to watch very closely the rollout of the Temporary Protection Directive and all the related efforts on the part of the EU to receive these people. Other human rights issues also arise in the context of what's happening in Ukraine. And the Fundamental Rights Agency will introduce this week the first of a new series of public bulletins on the fundamental rights implications within the EU of the war in Ukraine. And I hope this will be of value to everybody who is seeking to come up with the most meaningful responses. But what can we do? I mentioned 6 thematic areas of concern. Let me be, if you don't mind, be a little bit, symmetric and suggest six areas that we can engage as we push back against these concerns. And I'll try and do it equally to the same degree of brevity. In the first place, as we acknowledge the strong achievements in the EU, we have to stay invested in the current efforts to ever strengthen the toolbox of the EU to push back against the undermining of human and fundamental rights. I am deeply appreciative of some very important recent initiatives. There are the rule of law reports generated in the Commission, discussed in the Council. This is a really important innovation for which the co-legislators should be applauded. The efforts to put in place fundamental rights conditionality of the spending of EU money are enormously important. We're in the early stages, but they carry huge promise in terms of pressure for human and fundamental rights compliance, be that the rollout of the conditionality regulation, the recovery fund, and so forth. And let me add just 2 further important ongoing initiatives which are very important. One, of course, is the invocation of Article 7, and then there is to take an entirely disparate example in the area of social rights, the ever strengthened development of the pillar of social rights. All of these really important. Moving on to the second of my 6. As we look at the array of human rights concerns out there on the horizon, We have to pick our battles. We have to pick our battles smartly. We cannot engage everything with equal energy at the same time. And so I would encourage all of us in our diverse functions, our diverse roles, to focus in our battles on meta rights, on the protection of rights which are essential for the protection of other rights. One of those is freedom of expression. We must be very vigilant to ensure that the EU remains a safe space which cherishes free speech. Free speech is not absolute, it's subject to limits, but nevertheless, it has to be invested in continuously. And one other category of meta rights I'll mention before moving on is the rights of women. Every day, it is demonstrated to us how far we have to go to meaningfully deliver on the rights of women in our society. And then one last example of picking our battles wisely has to do with investing in protecting the infrastructure for the respect for human and fundamental rights. And here I flag threats to civil society. We used to talk about threats to civil society as something far away, out there, on the other side of the EU border. That's no longer the case. We have to acknowledge that civil society is under pressure within the member states, different ways in different places, but we must be vigilant and continue to respond. Third of my 6 has to do with human rights not being seen anymore as somehow peripheral to the great issues, but integral to them. We have to increasingly reframe our engagement with the great defining issues of the moment as being about issues of the respect for human and fundamental rights. Take, for example, digitalization. And here I would say that we've done a reasonably good job. The human rights dimensions of the development of the AI regulation, the Digital Services Act, and other critical initiatives coming out of the EU, does use a human rights frame to some extent. And I think that we should take some credit for that. The stories are not yet complete there, but they're in the right direction. But climate change is another of these fundamental issues of our societies. And here I argue we haven't had the same degree of progress in framing that issue as a human rights issue, which it is. But again, we need to go further. Moving to the fourth of my 6, we who work for fundamental and human rights are forever recalling that Europe is not an island all on its own out there alone. It is Europe in the world. And if ever there's a case of understanding Europe, its issues, its challenges, the responses as being one where we join hands across frontiers, it's in the area of human rights. We in Europe can learn a lot from the global south in terms of identifying human rights problems and responding to them. And we, in any case, have to integrate our responses to the problems, taking account that if you live in an EU member state, you're also subject to the scrutiny, not only of the EU, but also of the Council of Europe and the United Nations, and we have to join these up better. And again, that's a concern and a focus of attention of the Fundamental Rights Agency. The fifth of my 6 has to do with partnerships for the delivery of respect for human and fundamental rights in our societies. You cannot rely on actors like the Fundamental Rights Agency alone, actors like national human rights commissions alone. Rather, we have to build smart new constituencies fired by a vision of what our societies can look like, who can work together using the vocabulary and the tools of human rights. Give you some examples. We have to work better with faith communities. Ultimately, faith communities and the human rights movement, to a very large extent, share the same goals. But we need to do a better job of being partners where we agree. We can still respectfully disagree on any manner of things, but where we agree, respect for the rights of migrants, social justice, a decent reception of people from Ukraine, the list goes on forever. There we need to be more consciously partners. One other example is business. There's a tendency to problematize the business world when we talk of human rights, about remedies for violations, things of that nature. Very important. But we have to go way deeper than that. When you look at the extent to which our lives as humans are determined positively or negatively, predominantly by the private, not the public sector, we have to find ways to partner with the private sector so that we can achieve the necessary outcomes. And then 6th and finally, And again, a major preoccupation of my agency, we have to do a better job of convincing people of our human rights arguments, our human rights claims. We have to evidence our claims better. That's why the Fundamental Rights Agency is so heavily invested in a continuous surveying of vulnerable groups in Europe to allow the policymaker to build policy for those communities that's convincing and plausible and good value. That's about the evidence base, but it's also about communicating better. The human rights messages have historically tended to be not very compelling. And so we have to do a better job of framing the messages, being more convincing with the messages, relating them to human values in a more sophisticated manner. And again, that's something my agency is working closely on with partners. Thank you for listening. I want to end with a brief quote. We hosted a meeting here in Vienna last October, the Fundamental Rights Forum, and one of the most distinguished speakers at the forum was a woman called Eva Schloss. Eva Schloss is a Holocaust survivor. She grew up a girl in Vienna in the 1930s. She went through the horrors of incarceration and everything else that we associate with the Holocaust. Eva is still alive today, living in London. And she said to us at the Fundamental Rights Forum, she said, "It increasingly feels today for me like it was when I was a girl in Vienna in the 1930s. They were chilling words. Remember what was going on in Vienna in the 1930s. And Eva Schloss told us last October, before the war in Ukraine, that she felt that she was increasingly feeling that she was back in that moment in history. Now, I don't know if it's accurate or not, but I certainly tell you it's a wake-up call. And so as we embark on the discussion today, I think we must do so with a strong sense of urgency and an absence of any complacency. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Michael, not only for that very impressive tour d'horizon, but for those sobering and wise words at the end of your powerful remarks. We're most appreciative to you for sparing the time and spending it with us for this purpose today of this discussion. We're about 80 people on the WebEx events platform, and doubtless more on the live streaming, which we also do now, of these events. So we're probably well over 100 people to participate in the ongoing discussion. There'll be plenty of opportunity for everybody who is online to ask a question or make a comment. Please signal your interest in doing so through EPRS WebEx. It's very easy to do. And Michela Del Monte, who's going to be taking over the reins from now, she will try to bring in as many of you so that you can have your question posed and answered by our distinguished panel. Over to Michela.
Thank you, Anthony, and good afternoon, everybody. I think that was, as many others, inspired by the two introductory remarks. I took note of several elements, and I hope that we'll be able to touch upon some of them with our distinguished speaker. And I will introduce, first of all, Professor Elise Moore, who is the head of Department for International and European Law and head of the Institute for European Law at the KU Leuven, and visiting professor at the College of Europe in Bruges. Before that, she was associate professor in law at Maastricht University, and also she has been visiting lecturer at Sciences Po in Lille. And she is also currently working as principal investigator in a project called Reshuffling Our Understanding of Fundamental Rights Law in Europe, a project that is funded by the European Research Council. So please, Professor Moore, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ms. Del Monte, and allow me to thank, well, all the organizers of this event, the European Parliament Research Center, the Vice President, and also the Director of the FRA for his very thoughtful and inspiring presentation. I'm very honored to be here today, and also pleased as a beneficiary of EU funding to be able to share with your research services some thoughts and perhaps more in the discussion. So the title of this panel asks a question. Where are we on fundamental rights in the EU today? And I thought I would answer these questions with some fairly general comments, but also inviting further discussion, I hope. And I have to specify that my take on this, my lens of analysis, is a sort of institutional one. So I want to share a few thoughts on how I see the EU having evolved in terms of the way it designs and reflects on fundamental rights at EU level. And I think I want to make two key points. So there are two parts in my little speech today. One is to look at the duty to comply with fundamental rights in the EU. How has it evolved? How does it still remain limited in some ways? And second, I want to look at the possibilities. So something a bit more dynamic, a bit more forward-looking. What can we do within the existing framework of the EU treaties to better protect fundamental rights? So I start with the first point, the duties to comply with fundamental rights in the EU. Well, I think there are three features of this duty to comply with fundamental rights in the EU that have evolved in the past decade and maybe deserve some attention. Well, three evolutions and one standstill, let's say. So three remarks. One is there is a considerable increase in the diversity of sources for the protection of fundamental rights in the EU. And that's something I think that needs to be kept in mind. There is, of course, a charter that Vice President Karas mentioned earlier on, legally binding since 2009. But there are also the traditional instruments, the general principles of union law, which are inspired from the European Convention for Human Rights and the common constitutional traditions of the member states. And on that note, perhaps it's worth recalling that after the Lisbon Treaty, the EU shall exceed the European Convention for Human Rights, and perhaps today is an opportunity to briefly refresh our memories on the fact that, well, the negotiation process has been revived a year ago. Our lawyers are working, the lawyers of the European Union, of the member states of the European Union, and of the Council of Europe beyond the European Union, are working on trying to address the concerns of the Court of Justice as expressed in Opinion 213. And we occasionally can follow the head negotiator for the European Commission giving us some updates. So this is all accessible on the website of the Council of Europe and through some other social media for anyone interested. So there is progress there, although there remain some treaty difficulties, some genuine difficulties, in particular in relation to jurisdiction on the common foreign security policy. Now, nevertheless, a diversity of sources for the protection of fundamental rights, a charter, the general principles of union law, but others as well, such as international agreements for the protection of fundamental rights. The EU has now for more than a decade been a party to the UN Convention on the Rights for Persons with Disability. The EU is now progressing towards accession to the Istanbul Convention on violences against women and domestic violence. And importantly, and I'll come back to this in the second part of this presentation, there is an increasing amount of EU secondary law, EU legislation that shapes fundamental rights protection in the EU and maybe has even more potential than the one already existing today. So a diversification of the sources for the protection of fundamental rights in the EU legal order, well beyond, in fact, the Charter. Also, I believe, consolidating and giving visibility to the duty to comply with fundamental rights, a multiplication of actors engaging with EU fundamental rights protection. Of course, the Court of Justice of the European Union, in very close alliance with national courts, national authorities as well. But at EU level, well, the Commission, the rule of law report was mentioned a bit earlier on, but there is also the annual reports on the application of the Charter by the European Commission. The European Parliament itself is very active on monitoring fundamental rights compliance, also on, and I see some members of this audience today on, the Parliament has used this possibility of having a counter impact assessment, assessing the fundamental rights implication of a Commission proposal to amend the Return Directive a few years ago. The FRA, of course, and I cannot just, I can only repeat the great interest I had in the presentation by the director of the FRA a few minutes ago, Mr. Flaherty, very regularly engaging with fundamental rights, being increasingly public, and with a recent reform recently that extends its mandate, the FRA mandate, for example, on questions of police and justice cooperation in criminal matters. Now, multiplication of sources, multiplication of actors, but there is one thing that hasn't changed in EU law. That is that the commitments and the duties to comply with fundamental rights remain limited by the treaty framework, by the constitutional design of the European Union. The duty to comply with EU fundamental rights is limited to what takes place within the scope of European Union law as ultimately shaped by the EU treaties. Now that remains a point of discussion, of intense political controversies, but also of legal technical discussion. When are we not within the scope of Union law? But we know today, of course, that EU institutions, EU organs, for example, agencies such as Frontex, national authorities implementing EU law, derogating from EU law, and so on and so forth, do fall within the scope of Union law. But that remains something important to keep in mind, and a very serious limitation of what the EU can impose in terms of duties to comply with fundamental rights. Now, the second part of this presentation, I want to look in a slightly more dynamic way at the toolbox, which in fact, Michael Flaherty just mentioned a few minutes ago, the toolbox to better protect fundamental rights. We could look at many aspects, and in fact, the earlier presentations have mentioned many. We could look at monitoring, funding, information gathering. That's not the choice I've made. I've decided to just share a few thoughts on the power of EU legislation, of the use of EU legislation to protect further certain fundamental rights in the EU legal order. And I decided to focus with you on EU legislation for three reasons. First of all, because EU legislation can extend the scope of EU law, right? Once an EU competence is exercised, then the field, the implementation of the instruments or derogations to the instrument fall within the scope of Union law. So if we have a new directive that expands the scope of anti-discrimination law, for example, to prohibit discrimination on grounds of age, sexual orientation, etc., beyond employment, well, all of a sudden, these criteria that prohibit discrimination become applicable and relevant under EU law outside of the scope of the existing directives. And there are many other examples. For example, in the area of European criminal law, we have the directives on the rights of the defendant in criminal proceedings that considerably increase the influence of EU law on national procedural law. So EU legislation expands the scope of EU law. EU legislation can also help, and that's the second point, to clarify and give more visibility to the content of a fundamental right. For example, the anti-discrimination directives explain that prohibition of discrimination includes a prohibition of direct and indirect discrimination, that we assess the existence of a discriminatory effect, not necessarily the existence of a discriminatory intention. So EU legislation is very useful to operationalize the fundamental rights, which means that when the legislator shapes EU legislation having a strong fundamental rights dimension, it ought to take it very seriously to make sure that the design of the right does not go beyond existing standards, in particular in the member states or at the CHR, and in actually bringing more clarity and visibility and more protection, not less, which is an important thing to keep in mind in the area of EU migration law, for example. And finally, EU legislation can be very useful because next to extending the scope of EU law, next to giving more visibility and operationalizing standards of protection, EU legislation can be used to consolidate procedurally the protection of rights. So there is a lot of EU legislation, increasingly so, that organizes the burden of proof, that organizes the possibility for example, NGOs to be able to support victims bringing claims to court. We saw this also in a number of asylum cases or cases on irregular migration. EU legislation can also create or require the existence of independent bodies that will monitor and support the implementation of the specific policy of the European Union, such as the equality bodies. And we also know that the Commission is currently reflecting on the independence and the funding of these equality bodies. I think the director of the FRA a few minutes ago expressed concerns for the weakening of the infrastructure of fundamental rights at national level. Well, EU legislation can at least strengthen the standards in that respect. And perhaps I want to conclude with one final example on how far EU legislation can go. I think there is this very interesting Commission proposal for a directive on the application of the principle for equal pay for equal work or work of equal value between men and women, which in fact is designed to enhance transparency and enforcement mechanisms with some fairly ambitious duties on the employer to provide access to information, to report and to reassess the gender pay gap when it exists and is significant. So clearly to me, EU legislation is one among many other, one tools that could perhaps be even more used to support the protection of specific fundamental rights. So the duty, with more actors, more sources, nevertheless remaining within the context of the treaties, and within the context of the treaties, I believe, more possibilities to use EU legislation to protect fundamental rights. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Professor Moore. I noted down several points, and maybe we can come back at the end, especially when you mentioned the role of EU legislation also in domestic court and at national level, but also the role of the EU agency in relation, of course, within the remits of their respective competence. And on your late point on this directive of equal pay for equal work, I must say that the Parliament has asked, I think since 2012 or 13, it was an own legislative initiative, so Article 225. So it's as Vice President said before, Parliament in many cases was in the forefront to respect the fundamental rights. But I would like now to introduce our second speaker, who is Paul Nemetz, who is Principal Advisor in the Director General for Justice and Consumers in the European Commission since 2017. And prior to that, he was the Director for Fundamental Rights and Citizens' Rights in the same Director General. Mr. Nemetz is also visiting Professor of Law at the College of Europe in Bruges. He studied law at Hamburg University and obtained a Master in Comparative Law from George Washington University Law School in Washington, D.C. He also passed the first and second cycle of the Strasbourg Faculty for Comparative Law. Please, Mr. Nemetz, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation to today's very important discussion. I must say I very much appreciated the first presentations and also the introduction. And I concur wholeheartedly with what we have heard so far, in particular, of course, the more detailed remarks by Michael Flaherty, the director of FRA, and Professor Muir. Professor Muir, of course, has turned our attention to something which is important to see, namely that in the EU system, making fundamental rights work is also a matter of political choices. And she has recalled the importance of legislation to operationalize and even extend fundamental rights, at least the scope of application of the Charter of Fundamental Rights. And so basically what she has done is she has reminded the European Commission as the body of initiative of EU law of its great responsibility when it comes to really fulfilling the promise which the Charter of Fundamental Rights and all the other sources, the primary law sources, give to citizens on human rights. So we have to not to confuse things. We have learned from Kant and Hume that we cannot conclude to what should be from what is, and this is also the division of labor in the European Union between the Fundamental Rights Agency in Vienna, which is an empiric body which studies the situation of human rights and does surveys, but the duty of the Commission then is to draw on its own initiative and also not always only relying on FRA input, but on its appreciation of the situation to make the necessary political proposals for legislation and also financing, and also as a guardian of the law of the treaty to take matters to court where the non-compliance with EU law and fundamental rights so requires. And I would say that while there remains a lot to be done for the future, the Commission has grown into this role. And while I do concur that the reporting of the Commission in the Fundamental Rights Annual Report and the Rule of Law reports are very, very important tools, of course, we need to look at the legislative initiatives, and we must look at the willingness of the Commission to take matters to court. I think these are, let's say, the probably politically most important steps, but also for individuals and for operationalizing the law. This is, to say it a little bit bluntly, more than just talking. This reminds us, first of all, of the trias of our constitutional settlement, namely human rights, rule of law, and democracy. And I would like to dwell a little bit on the relationship between democracy and fundamental rights and the rule of law. And I would like to emphasize 2 points in particular. First, the rule of law debate, which we have today, focuses mainly on the independence of courts. And this is very, very important. But the rule of law also requires the making of the law. And it is important and notable that in particular in the areas of digital, the digital future, but also in other areas, we now witness a return to the law. Behind us is a time where there was a lot of doubt about the value of secondary law in the European Union. We had a lot of efforts of self-regulation and ethics. And we can now see a return of the law, and which makes me also remind of the importance of democratic process. We cannot continue, as was done by some in the past, to talk down the law, but we must relearn to respect the law as the most noble expression of democracy. So I'm very, very happy to see that this spirit is back in Europe, and the Commission already can look back on a new track record of legislative initiatives which are very, very important to make fundamental rights a reality in the future. And Mrs. Muir, Professor Muir mentioned a few of these elements. I would like to add a few. I would like to put there all the bodies of legislation relating to the giving legal shape to the digital space, the internet and digital technologies, not only the AI regulation, not only the DSA, but I think we have to look at all the measures relating to the digital space and the internet. And this is very, very important, because in this world, when we think about digital, we are still up against the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace of John Perry Barlow and the related ideology of keeping the internet unbroken and free of law. And so I think it is notable that the Commission has made the clear choice to let democracy do its job in Europe, and that we are not following, at least not following anymore, this doctrine of, that any law which is done only on a regional level breaks the unity of the internet. I think that is a very important remark. And we have passed also important measures, for example, on the protection of whistleblowers, which don't contain the word digital, but become very, very important to give effect to the rule of law and the protection of fundamental rights in the new complex world of technology. That's my first remark, hooking on a little bit to what I found very important in Professor Muir's presentation. The second point I would like to pick up is a point which Michael Flaherty made, namely that we have to strengthen the instruments and mechanisms which effectuate, and he mentioned specifically the space for civil society in Europe. And here again, I would like to remark that there are a number of ways in which the Commission has laid a ground for strengthening civil society space. First, the possibility of introducing collective claims of civil society actors, so independent of individuals being concerned, the space for civil society to bring cases in the public interest, which protect fundamental rights, has been increased by EU law. But second, we are also substantially increasing our financing for civil society in the European Union. We have in this financial period an allocation of nearly €500 million of euros now, which we are also distributing in new ways, in a decentral way, to actors of civil society who are active in relation to democracy, fundamental rights, and EU values. And let us make no mistake, it is important that the state or the member states, but also the European Union as a public body takes responsibility for the financing of civil society. Here we are also showing that we have a different approach to fundamental rights than what some may be preaching from America, namely, don't take money from the state, don't take money from the European Union. We hope very much that in the tradition of many of our member states, where it is completely normal that civil society, and by the way, also often political parties, are publicly financed, civil society in Europe will take up this offer, and an offer which clearly is based on the political consideration, both in the Commission and in the European Parliament, and also in the Council, that we need to strengthen our civil society in light of attacks on democracy, fundamental rights, and the rule of law, coming both from governments, but also from other actors. I would like to say clearly that in the Brussels debate, we need also to strengthen civil society's voice when it comes to lawmaking. It is still a huge imbalance in the political process in Europe. We have heard that Michael Flaherty says we want to work with companies, and that's certainly also the case for the European Commission. We listen always to companies, but the reality of the lawmaking process is that we see two tendencies which have been documented over and over also by academia. First, the Council, in relation to many legislative proposals, brings down the level of fundamental rights protection, while the Parliament, on the other hand, ups the level of fundamental rights protection. This has been seen in particular and documented very well in relation to migration law. And second, the intervention of business in legislative processes very often serves to reduce the level of the horizontal application of fundamental rights, namely when it is when it concerns the protection of individuals against the overarching power of private companies. So while we cherish cooperation, I think in a discussion like ours in the research context, we must also make things clear and not create an impression, that everybody is working all the time in the same direction. Let me finally say a word about the impacts, the very specific impacts of the war in the Ukraine on fundamental rights in Europe, and what the Commission is doing in this context. We see the key impacts related to the rights of the child, and we are strengthening our work in this area together with member states. But we have also set up a task force to document war crimes, and the Freeze and Seize task force, headed by Justice Commissioner Reinders, to see how we can better in Europe make sure that sanctions are made effective, and to tackle other, let's say, immediate reactions to the Russian aggression on the Ukraine. And I mention these policies and in particular the Freeze and Seize Task Force because, again, it doesn't carry the name fundamental rights and human rights policy, but in its effect, also in its deterrent effect against future aggressors, but also in relation, for example, to the possibility to collect funds which then may be redistributed to the victims of the aggression. This has a huge impact on how we make fundamental rights work. So in conclusion, I would say the Commission as the body of initiative is at the center of developing new instruments, whether financial or legislative, and we seek actively the dialogue with civil society and with academia, and of course with the agency in Vienna, the Fundamental Rights Agency, and its long-standing great director, Michael Flaherty, because we seek inspiration, how we can move forward in this important field, how to design new legislation which effectuates fundamental rights, how to design programs of financing to make fundamental rights effective. I would say we have come very far, but the task to define concrete measures which bring real progress for people is a task which we share and where we want to listen and we want to receive input. And I think that is the challenge before us. It is a challenge of going beyond declarations and great words and reports. It is the challenge of designing measures which make a difference in the real world, but which then also find the necessary political majorities in the Parliament and in the Council of Ministers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nemitz. Where you mentioning the action of the Commission, and very timely in relation also to the war aggression, I was also thinking about the proposal to allow Eurojust to collect and store evidence for the war crime, which is very, very immediate, I would say. And you also mentioned, which reminds me another speech I heard once you mentioned the democracy, fundamental rights, and the rule of law, the three elements, as our Vice President mentioned. And I heard once an interview of Professor Joseph Weiler, who said those are the holy trinity of the European project, which is very talkative to me. But now I would like to pass the floor to Sarah Ganti, who is FUO postdoctoral fellow at the Human Rights Center of Ghent University. She is also candidate at the Yale Law School and visiting professor in Vienna. She holds a PhD from Vrije University of Brussels and LLM from Yale Law School. Since 2019, she has been teaching EU law, legal theory, philosophy of human rights, inter alia at the University Saint-Louis in Brussels, at the Central University, European University in Vienna, where she is now, I understand, and the Université Libre de Bruxelles. And please, Ms. Ganti, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Michaela. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Vice President Karas, Dr. O'Flaherty, Professor Muir, and Professor Nemitz for their previous remarks. I would like to zoom in on anti-discrimination law, an important subject when it comes to the challenges of fundamental rights. And to say a few words on a report that I wrote with my colleague, Dr. Juan Carlos Benito Sanchez, and which was commissioned by ECINET. This report is about expanding the list of protected grounds within anti-discrimination law in the EU. And the conclusion of the report are very simple and echo the first observation of Dr. O'Flaherty, the persistence of some groups' exclusion. Many groups, vulnerable groups, such as people living in poverty and trans, non-binary and intersex persons, still fall through the cracks of anti-discrimination law protection in the EU, despite the important commitment of the EU and its member states in the fight against discrimination. And why so? We show in the report that it is because the grounds which are protected in EU law and in national anti-discrimination laws are too limited. At EU level, the protection against discrimination is limited to 6 grounds, the 6 grounds enshrined in Article 19 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the EU, namely sex, racial or ethnic origin, religion or belief, disability, age, and sexual orientation. And in the report, you agree that although the unanimity rule of Article 19, which is highly problematic when it comes to do some progress in anti-discrimination law, especially regarding the ground, is a real barrier to expand the ground, there are still important avenues at EU level, including through the Charter of Fundamental Rights. And we also argue that there are even more avenues at national level where member states can protect more grounds than the 6 grounds enshrined in the treaty. And more specifically, in the report, we focused on 3 grounds. First, the grounds of health, which is increasingly important in anti-discrimination law since the pandemic broke out. The grounds of, and we put it in one packet, of gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics, which is a huge challenge at EU level, and also the ground of socioeconomic situation. We touched upon other grounds, but these 3 grounds, health, socioeconomic situation, gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics, are the main grounds which pose challenges at EU level and in their member states. So, of course, we wrote the report, and which is available online. We analyzed the literature, the case law, some surveys, some reports, but we also wanted to understand what is happening on the grounds. And so we did some survey sent to 15 equality bodies. We also interviewed and made like in-depth interviews of 7 equality bodies and of 7 stakeholders, including the FRA. And it's very interesting because also the anti-discrimination law framework is very different in each country, and each country has its own challenges and specificities regarding anti-discrimination law and the grounds protected in anti-discrimination law. There is one consensus. The consensus that the 6 grounds enshrined in EU law are not encompassing enough. Expanding the list of grounds in anti-discrimination law in Europe is key to ensure the effectiveness and coherence of anti-discrimination law and to remedy some of its shortcomings. So now, for the 5 minutes I have left, I won't have the time to focus on each grounds that we studied in the report, but I would like to focus on one ground which actually echoes one very big issue that Michael O'Flaherty mentioned earlier. He mentioned the huge challenge of socioeconomic inequalities. And what we argue in the report is that the other side of the coin is socioeconomic discrimination. People being discriminated against because of their socioeconomic situation. Socioeconomic discrimination is an everyday life reality for millions of people around the globe, and the problem is that this reality is still invisible. And this reality exists also in Europe, and I could spend hours and hours giving you a list of examples of socioeconomic discrimination. We can cite, for instance, the French Defender of Rights report of 2017, which shows that in France, 42% of people relying on health assistance because of their low socioeconomic situation were refused an appointment with dentist, gynecologist, or psychiatrist because they rely on health assistance. In France also, some schools implemented the practice of special menus, which restrict children's access to normal school meals, what we call the lunch shaming practice, with the sole aim of forcing parents to pay their debt. So this practice was implemented in some schools until the French Defender of Rights ruled that such a measure constitutes an instance of discrimination on the economic vulnerability of these children and their parents. And we see here in France that the ground of socioeconomic situation, more specifically the economic vulnerability, is a protected ground. So here the French defender of rights could basically take a position and say that there was a discrimination. And there are many other examples. We see in some European countries, whether it is in the UK or it used to be the case in Portugal, that some parents are likely to lose the custody of their children only because they are living in a situation of poverty. We also see that in some European countries, such as Germany, people who are not able to pay a fine for low-level offenses, for instance, because they didn't pay their ticket in the metro, are likely to be put in jail. And we also see, like in some schools, European schools, schools in European countries, that when children do not dress in the way properly, they tend to be discriminated against by the staff of the school and also by the other kids. So there are many, many examples, and this is a reality. But what is striking is that prohibition of discrimination on grounds of socioeconomic status has not fully made its way into the anti-discrimination law landscape of most European countries. When we look at the map of taken broadly of 49 countries in Europe, only 18 explicitly enshrine the ground of socioeconomic situation. And among these 18 countries, we found out that actually in many countries, this ground is not really implemented. So you will ask me, but why so? We have a reality which is there. We have a ground which exists and is protected in some countries, so why so? And we try in the report to point out some reasons, and I will only give you 3, because I think this is really important to understand why, in order to make this ground more effective. So first, the question of individual responsibility and poverty. People tend to think, and not only people in the street, but also we speak about organizations and people working on an everyday basis with fundamental rights. People tend to think that poverty is a question of individual responsibility. What Chiara Bridges called and coined the moral construction of poverty. Why many reports have shown that poverty is linked to structural reasons, and that it takes generations to get out of poverty. And so the fact that people tend to think that poverty is an individual responsibility, we tend to think that people are responsible of their own situation, so there is no reason to help when they are discriminated against on ground of the socioeconomic situation. This is, of course, mistaken, and we need to reverse and to speak out about the fact that poverty is about structural reasons. The second reason, and this is really important, and this is something that also Michael O'Flaherty mentioned, it's the question of social rights, socioeconomic rights. People tend to confuse socioeconomic discrimination and socioeconomic rights. And in the report, we explain that the two are different and the two complement each other. On the one hand, we have socioeconomic rights, which are mainly about distribution or redistribution, and which are about the minimum socioeconomic threshold for people, as Samuel Mon has shown in his book, Equal is Not Enough. Socioeconomic discrimination is different. Protection against socioeconomic discrimination implies protecting people who are treated differently and disproportionately in their access to their rights and their socioeconomic rights more particularly. So let's take and come back to the example of people who try to have access to healthcare. There is a social right, access to healthcare, but what we see in this report of the Défenseur des droits in France is that people are discriminated against in their access to healthcare because of their socioeconomic situation. And the third reason, which is extremely important to understand, is the question of underreporting. People living in poverty, people who have a low socioeconomic status, tend to be stereotyped, to be victim of prejudice, stigma, and they feel ashamed of the situation. And it is in many studies regarding the non-take-up issues, so when people don't dare to claim their rights, show that because people feel ashamed, they won't claim their right. And it is the same for the question of discrimination. Because they feel ashamed of the situation, people won't dare to say, I've been discriminated against. So there are many other reasons, but these are the main one I wanted to point it out. And just to finish my presentation on the reasons why we need to recognize explicitly the ground of socioeconomic situation in anti-discrimination law, and why we need to implement it. And I would like to give you 3 reasons for that. So prohibition of discrimination on grounds of socioeconomic status is crucial to break the cycles that perpetuate poverty and socioeconomic disadvantage. Socioeconomic rights are not enough because I've seen, firstly, discrimination on grounds of socioeconomic status is a reality, and recognizing it and fighting against it through the tool of anti-discrimination law is one important solution. Secondly, when socioeconomic status is not enshrined in anti-discrimination law, there is no other proxy ground to ensure any protection to people who are victims of such discrimination. For instance, people who are discriminated against on ground of their gender identity, for instance, gender reassignment, they have found some protection in the case law of the European Court of Justice through the ground of sex. The ground of sex was the proxy. No such ground exists, no such proxy ground exists in the case of socioeconomic discrimination. And finally, and I think this is a really important point, and that Michael O'Flaherty also mentioned, is the fact that socioeconomic discrimination is in many instances part of multiple or intersectional discrimination, especially when it concerns, on the one hand, Roma community, but also, on the other hand, women who are disproportionately represented among people living in poverty. So in conclusion, there is a urgent need to expand the list of grounds, especially to the ground of socioeconomic status, gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristic, as well as health. Very important ground, especially following the breakout of the pandemic, at EU level, through the Charter, but also and mainly at national levels. And in this regard, we argue that organizations such as the FRA, but also and especially the equality bodies, have a central role to play in the expansion of grounds in European anti-discrimination law and their implementation. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm going to introduce my colleague David in a second, but I just want to read the question that, because there is a question for both Professor Moore and Dr. Nemetz, so while David is speaking, they can maybe think about it. It's from my colleague Katharina Eisele. She wrote, regarding the multiplication of actors in protecting fundamental rights in the EU, how can it be ensured that responsibility is not shifted or blurred? For example, who is responsible for monitoring and enforcing the compliance with fundamental rights of migrants at EU external borders, Frontex, the Commission, and/or the Member States? And now I would like to introduce my colleague, David de Groot, who is policy analyst in the Citizens Policy Unit in EPRS, where he covers different dossiers, including EU citizenships, legal migration, family law, and non-discrimination and fundamental rights. And prior to joining EPRS, David was affiliated to the University of Bern and the National Center of Competencies in Research in Switzerland. He holds an LLB and LLM degrees from the European Law School in Maastricht University, and is Dr. Juris of the University of Bern. And in addition to that, David also covers LGBTI rights for EPRS. And today, as Vice President mentioned, is International Day Against Homophobia. So I'm very pleased to give the floor to David.
Thank you, Mika. Yes, indeed. So today's Ida Hobbit, so it's very suitable to also have a focus on the fundamental rights of the LGBTIQ community. And since I'm a lawyer, I would like to focus on some legal aspects, especially concerning the interaction between EU free movement law and the European Convention on Human Rights on issues falling outside of the scope of EU law. And I would like to do this on the basis of a few examples. Let's start with the first one. Last September, the European Parliament called on the Commission to propose a change to the Free Movement Directive, specifically concerning the condition on the residence rights of a registered partner, where currently the directive requires that this is only required if the legislation of the host member state treats registered partnerships as equivalent to marriage. A very correct request in my view. Before joining the EPRS, I wrote a study for DG Justice at the European Commission, specifically on the implementation of this paragraph, and there are a lot of issues. But I would also like to say, from a legal perspective, from a human rights perspective, the condition already is non-existent. It's automatically fulfilled. And the following might sound a bit paradoxical. From a legal perspective, even when there is no registered partnership in the host member state, and this member state has not introduced same-sex marriage, this condition is automatically fulfilled. The point is, on the basis of the case law of the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, a member state is under an obligation that if it does not provide for same-sex marriage, it has to provide for a registered partnership, which is open to same-sex couples. This was established first in Oliari versus Italy, where the court stated that in the absence of marriage, same-sex couples, like the applicants, have a particular interest in obtaining the option of entering into a form of civil union or registered partnership, since this would be the most appropriate way in which they could have their relationship legally recognized and which would guarantee them the relevant protection in the form of core rights relevant to a couple in a stable and committed relationship without unnecessary hindrance. After the Oliari case, there were still many voices that said that this case only applies to the respondent state, Italy, and that it does not provide for a general rule since it would depend on the developments in each specific state. Since last September, this cannot be really said anymore. In the case Fedotova and others, the European Court of Human Rights considered that Russia, yes, Russia, failed in its obligations by not providing for a registered partnership for same-sex couples. To be fully transparent, Russia appealed the judgment to the Grand Chamber where it's still pending, but I have my doubts that a different verdict will come there. Family reunification is a core right. And additionally, from the case law of the European Court of Justice concerning social benefits that should be granted to same-sex registered partnerships, it's clear that there have to be very weighty reasons not to grant a certain right which is granted to marriage equally to the registered partnership, where this registered partnership is the maximum status available to same-sex couples. And one should remember this maximum status available also in the context of the Temporary Protection Directive, because Ukraine does not have a registered partnership. So same-sex couples, the maximum status available to them is unmarried. There is nothing. And that has to be taken into account when implementing the Temporary Protection Directive. Otherwise, it will be direct discrimination based on sexual orientation. But so, I want also to make clear that this goes quite far, because in the case of Frederick Hay, the Court of Justice considered that a Pacte de Solidarité from France, which is a very weak registered partnership, especially at the time, it was considered equivalent to marriage. So, for these reasons, it's quite clear that the member states already have to recognize a registered partnership for the purpose of free movement law, even if they have not introduced such a registered partnership and do not provide for same-sex marriage. Because not having a registered partnership is a violation of the ECHR. And thus, even if substantive family law is outside of the scope of EU law, this would equally be a violation of EU law. Would the Court of Justice follow my reasoning? I'm not so sure, but it used to. In KB versus National Health Service Pension Agency and Secretary of State for Health, judgment from 2003, the Court of Justice considered that legislation which, in breach of the ECHR, prevents a couple from fulfilling the marriage requirement, which must be met for one of them to be able to benefit from a certain benefit derived from secondary legislation, is incompatible with EU law. I find it rather clear. Let's get to a second example. There's a case pending at the European Court of Human Rights, Szybiszewska versus Poland, where Poland refused to issue its nationals a certificate of non-impediment in order to marry abroad. It's not entirely clear where abroad, but my guess would be in another member state. Such a certificate states that the person is not married and that there are no legal issues for the person to enter into a marriage with another person. Poland refused to issue these documents because it concerned same-sex marriage. I presume that in the national proceedings, EU law did not come up, or that the National Court considered EU law irrelevant, as it usually does since it concerns family law. One should consider, though, that this refusal not only hampers the couple from marrying, it equally would prevent them from relying on the rights of residence guaranteed to the spouse of an EU citizen. The member states are hiding behind competences that are outside of the scope of EU law, but quite often their rules are incompatible with the ECHR, and the Union should not accept this. Also, the Court of Justice has lately not often rebuffed national courts where there were clear human rights violations outside the scope of EU law with an impact to EU law. And often it also does not rephrase questions, even though this means that the answer becomes ambiguous. And it's really time that it changes this. Because national courts quite often interpret the Court of Justice's judgments restrictively. This you can see, for example, concerning the Coman judgment. The Coman judgment has created many questions concerning its scope, since it deviates from the European Court of Human Rights case law. But there is one point, though, where there's actually no question at all. Whether family life should have been established and lived in the member state where the same-sex marriage was established. That's one of the conditions set in the final sentence. But this requirement in the judgment comes from a very specific line of case law concerning nationals returning to their member state of nationality with their family members and what conditions they have to fulfill. It does not mean that where the marriage was concluded in a third country, the member state could refuse to give a residence permit. This would run also counter to the Mattock judgment, where the court stated that the Union citizen and his spouse can benefit from the Free Movement Directive irrespective of when and where the marriage took place. This is also clear from the European Court of Human Rights case law, where it slightly deviates on how it has to be recognized, but it has to be recognized even when it was, in a few cases, the marriage was established in Canada. So it would be very good if new cases would be referred to the court to finally clarify these points. The Court of Justice has a few times said, or when he says at conferences, we are not a human rights court. And no, it's not. It's not the Strasbourg court. But human rights are an integral part of EU law, and the court should, again, start acting like it. Even if a human rights violation is outside the scope of EU law, it has an impact, and the Court of Justice should address this. The court knows the law. Jura novit curiae. It should act like it. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And now I would like to give back the floor to Professor Moore and Dr. Nemitz if they would like to answer the question I mentioned before.
Yeah, well, of course, this is a question for $1 million, no, or 1 million euros. I think the question you ask goes beyond the issue of external border control. In fact, as the process of European integration advances, administrative procedures and enforcement mechanisms are increasingly involving both EU and national entities. And certain areas are very sensitive. The EU depends on coherent external border control, but the member states are largely primarily in charge of external border control. So who is in charge is a big question. I think that the one point I wanted to make, I don't have a perfect answer, Katarina, and I think you know that, is the first question is just, I think it's beyond the example of external border control. I think there are a number of areas of EU law now which are so integrated and so where the EU is so dependent from what the member states are doing that these questions of who is responsible for monitoring become increasingly important. And the second point I just wanted to make to rebound on your question is it shows that the role of EU agencies such as Frontex is not always negative. I mean, sometimes we see, for example, Frontex as being itself responsible, co-responsible for certain fundamental rights breaches. And we wonder how we can tackle this. And I know this is a very burning issue in the European Parliament. But alternatively, agencies can be very useful allies for fundamental rights protection. They can give us eyes on what is happening at the borders. But for that, there must be a legal framework that gives them legitimacy to be on the ground through, for example, Schengen evaluation mechanisms or inquiries on the ground, which cannot necessarily be announced. So I guess that's probably what is at stake in the reform of the Schengen control system. So no perfect answer. I cannot answer that question ideally. I guess it's again for the EU legislature, I think, to clarify this. And I do realize it's a very sensitive issues. And I think that's just elements of answers.
Yes, maybe if I can add, I think the problem already lies in the question, in the sense that I think in questions of complying with higher law, we always have to look at the first actor. So those who exercise public power, that act of public power, which may not be in line with higher law, that is the core of the problem. And I think there we have the core responsibility. So it will often be the member state, or in the rare cases where the Commission executes EU law, like in competition law, there may be an issue. In the case where Frontex acts actually and exercises public power, that's already a big question. Is Frontex exercising public power, or is it the member state? But where that is the case, it is this first act of exercising public power, I think, what we should focus on. Anything afterwards, I think there you're right, becomes diluted, because the question of monitoring many do, and rightly so. I mean, why should there only be one monitor? The European Fundamental Rights Agency monitors, the Commission monitors, the Parliament monitors, the OSCE monitors. Also under the Convention of Human Rights, there's a monitoring mechanism. So monitoring is for many. But when it comes to the hard law question, we must allocate the responsibility to the first actor exercising public law, and there must be mechanisms to hold them responsible. And these are normally not the mechanisms of monitoring, but these are the mechanisms of judicial control of the exercise of public power. That would be my answer. And I think it is maybe putting the wrong emphasis to talk about a dilution of monitoring duties, because monitoring is, I think it is only coming after the control of the exercise of public power through the mechanisms foreseen for that purpose.
Thank you both. I'm looking at the other two speakers if they want to add something, because we are already running out of time. So I take this opportunity to thank you, all of you, for taking the time to stay with us and to share your expertise. And I conclude just by announcing the next Policy Hub organized by EPRS is on Thursday at 11. It's about war crimes, definition, collection of evidence, and prosecution. And with that, I wish you all a nice afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.